Okay, here I am on my second read, and I guess I should kind of highlight this information to show myself this was my first read. And then I'm going to go ahead and use the pink pen for my second read. And this is just to help me differentiate between my thoughts. And so for the second read, I'm thinking not just about content, which is what I thought about with my first read, but now I'm thinking about kind of structure and the writing elements of it. So here I have this idea of students, right, and surveillance, which are two main ideas within the topic. And that's important because your title should always tell a little bit about your topic. Oh, sorry for that noise. Then I notice how they're starting off the introduction here, right? We have this Ashley who they're kind of talking about. So I have an anecdote, right, a short story. And it gives some background about what's happening. And then as I go on to this, notice how the little anecdote lasts for about 2 paragraphs. So my introduction actually ends, I would say here. I'm going to put end of intro. We often think about introductions as 1 paragraph, but I notice that it's quite longer here. I notice use of dialogue here, right? She was in tears, right? That kind of description. I would have liked a stronger verb, of course, but here I have a nice strong verb, right? She logged off. And then look at this lovely transition I have. Ashley is one of the many students who are being asked to use remote proctoring services. And I'm going to notice this link, right? Because that link is going to be important, most likely. We're going to come back to that in our third read. Okay, services. This is now I'm getting background information. Like, why are we even using these services? And why is this a new problem? Well, it's a new problem because of the pandemic, right? People are taking exams online now. We haven't had this issue. So in theory, it's like useful. So like, hey, this is a positive thing. But we have this negative that it's a huge source of stress, and people are saying, right, students are saying that it's heavily stressful, right? They're feeling surveyed. It's this awkwardness. So then they have another example. So they Proctor use CEO, right? They have kind of, I would call this kind of an expert. Who is it? And they answered our technology. And see, I'm scanning because I've already read it once. Some test providers. So this is additional information. This I would call evidence, right? What background evidence more because they're telling us about it. I would also call this piece evidence, and we call this anecdotal evidence, right? It's a story. So it's one type of evidence. All right, so this, according to practical policy, right? This is more evidence here. They're showing us the policy, what's happening. They can give information, personal data. This to me is crazy. I'm curious about this lawful request still, so I'm going to highlight that again. Wow, that is a lot of users. That is a lot of people. And I'm curious if this story is common or if it is just kind of, I don't know. I'd be curious about numbers in general. Okay, so let's continue on. Now we're looking at another example, right? Second anecdote. Right, B has used a similar story. So we have this nice transition again of a similar story. According to B, see how we have this kind of introduction. Proctor has access to her video camera, monitor movements. And what do they mean by monitor movements? I've despised, right? We have dialogue again. Not to use her real name, right? Which is totally fine and something that you might want to think about as we're writing about our communities and people that we know. On one occasion, I was flagged, so I have a concrete example, right? Because she has an eye problem, an eye issue that she had to deal with. But then, see this idea of flagging? They have this idea of flagging here, and then they transition to the next paragraph. But this one is B talking, and this one is Olson, who's like the person who, from the previous one that we saw, what was their first name? Faculties, Mike Olson right up here, right? they can show me. So this is a good explanation of what's kind of happening in the background, but it doesn't seem like it's quite connecting. This I thought was crazy, right? This is another like example of security issues. And you all know this just as well as I do, that everything is ending up online now. And so you have to think about privacy when you're recording people, when you're recording out, you know, in the world, that these are real life people with lives. And so this teacher put on Reddit, which is a social media site, and they took it down, of course. Okay, according to this website, so I have evidence here. The software does not collect personal. However, right? So I have like, okay, there's evidence that like, hey, this is gonna, plus they don't do this, but it might, this is more negative, right? Take a screenshot of the student's desktop. So here we almost have it set up like it's something that like it could be good, but then it's not. It's almost like an argument and then the counter argument. So I'm just gonna write that. I'm gonna say like argument, right? Counter argument. We're used to kind of essays going through all of the information and then at the very end, maybe having a counter argument, but this is interesting because a counter argument is almost sprinkled throughout the essay. So let's continue on. All right, page 4. I thought this was super interesting, a 360 degree, and I thought this was really interesting. So one, we have the surveillance privacy issue, but now we have other issues of other communities, right? We have low income students, right? Talking about that might be not have their own bedroom. So I'm going to put social issues introduced. And again, I feel like this is really late in the essay, but it really works. There's not a right or a wrong way to put it or place it. You know, you kind of have to think about where the story is leading and how you want to set it up. So we have low income students, right? Students with learning disabilities. And then we of course have this example of a transgender student, right, who had to use their dead name, which made them very uncomfortable and shouldn't have to deal with that. Like it's the barriers to the extra step. So I would say all these things are kind of negative. This is still like I had to wait for the professor. Right? It's none of his business. According to HonorLock, so this is another company. So I'm going to say additional example. So notice how they're not just using one person and they're not just using one company. They're building a case on both sides using several different pieces of evidence. While they actively collect students' IP addresses, email address for a limited, I'd be very curious about the limited time period. Right? Many law students are somewhat unhappy. United Health Services taking remote bar. Okay, so here's a transition where they're talking about an exam, and then a big exam that we all might be familiar with is the bar exam. And so this is transitioning to a very new idea. Here we go. Students have alleged sophomores racist, right? Which is another problem that we're seeing here, another social issue. And then let's go to the almost the last page. For the last 6 months, invasive artificial intelligence, right? And notice kind of the language being used here. And I loved this. This was a great quote. When you think about using a quotation and you look at quotations that are being used, you want really powerful quotations. Everything else you can kind of summarize, but this was probably a long interview for this one sentence that was like perfect. Right? What this experience is solidified is a BIPOC law known. Lawyers are only comfortable highlighting racism, ableism, sexism, transphobia once it comes outside, but they refuse to acknowledge it on the inside, right? A very powerful statement. And look how it's introduced. We have kind of who is introducing it. We have a little bit of the quotation, then we have who is speaking, and then we finish up the quotation. So it's interesting how you can kind of change where you put the attribution tag in your writing. Adequate lighting written for all test takers, non-bias. So they are arguing it doesn't do this. So I'm curious about numbers, right? In July, Civil Liberties Union said that they shouldn't do this, right? So there is evidence, kind of core evidence, that this is happening out there. We take privacy very seriously. So it seems like they're saying that, but I question that, you know, remote proctoring, spying, right? So this is really the crux of the matter, and this really goes in the thesis. So know how the thesis is sprinkled throughout. It's not just one sentence that's in the essay, but it kind of is going throughout the essay, always coming back to this idea, hey, this is weird, this isn't right? This is spying. seems more effective at surveillance and accurately determine whether students are cheating. Right, decide whether they're chosen to. It's a hostile learning environment, right? So saying like some professors don't like this. So this is kind of a plus for it in response, but it's a distraction rather than aid to learning. I guess that's not a plus to it's an addition to the thesis, not a plus to whether or not it's good or bad. Right, considered the norm. I also have some more questions after reading this. So some questions I have is I would be interested in more stats and numbers of students kind of feeling this way. I'd also be curious of more, and maybe I would click on some of those privacy. So I'm going to make a little note, click on some of the privacy agreements. And there was something else I was kind of thinking of as I was reading through it. ExamSoft. Notice there's not really a call to action, but you definitely understand what they're trying to kind of understand. Oh, I guess my other thing I was thinking of was, okay, they don't really address cheating though at all. Like if this is still an issue, right? This is the issue. Like how do we do online learning without students cheating? There's no solution. And that's important because sometimes in writing we feel like, oh, well, I need to say exactly what it has to do, but not all writing necessarily does that. So that's something to think about, especially with these bigger issues. I think, yeah, it might be stronger with maybe a hint at a solution, but I would argue it doesn't always have to be. So this is my second read, really looking at the techniques and ideas. And this is much deeper read than kind of my first one. And both are important, but sometimes we try to do like the first and second read together and it gets very jumbly. So I always encourage you to do the first read and then come back and do your second read. That's a much deeper